"You are not the woman from the photograph." The heavy steam of the arriving locomotive still hissed around the iron wheels, thick and suffocating in the brutal afternoon heat. Gideon stood on the weathered wooden planks of the station platform, a towering mass of a mountain man, gripping a delicate silver locket in his calloused palm. He stared at the tiny, fragile portrait inside the metal casing, then slowly raised his dark eyes to the absolute giant standing before him. Elowen did not flinch. She stood well over 6 feet tall, her broad shoulders squaring beneath a faded, dust-covered canvas dress. The sheer, overwhelming muscle of her arms strained against the coarse homespun fabric. She carried a massive iron-bound trunk that would have broken the back of a normal man, holding the tremendous weight effortlessly with one hand. "The woman in the photograph is not coming," Elowen replied, her voice a low, steady rumble over the noise of the departing train. She waited for the rejection. She expected the disgust. Elowen had spent her entire life being viewed as a beast of burden, a creature too massive to be considered a proper lady, and too intimidating to be loved. She braced herself for the anger of the giant standing across from her. But the truth of why she stood on this dusty platform, instead of the fragile bride he paid for, was far more complicated than anyone imagined. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button, and comment what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, competing with the metallic screech of the train, pulling away from the station. Gideon rubbed the rough edge of his thumb against the side of his index finger, a slow and rhythmic motion he always used when his mind wrestled with a heavy burden. He had spent 6 months writing letters to a woman named Clara, dreaming of a delicate, soft-spoken creature who would bring warmth to the freezing loneliness of his high mountain cabin. He wanted someone to protect. He wanted someone fragile. The woman standing before him looked as though she could wrestle a full-grown steer to the ground. Wild, heavy dust coated the skin of her arms, and sweat gleamed along the sharp line of her jaw. She was a survivor, carved from the same unyielding rock as the mountains towering behind the town. The townspeople began to stop and stare. The whispers started immediately. The men loitering near the general store pointed at the sheer size of the woman, laughing behind their hands. The gaze of the crowd felt like burning coals against the skin of Elowen. She shifted her weight, pulling the heavy trunk closer to her side, building an invisible wall around her dignity. She had endured the mockery of the world for years, but the cruelty never stopped hurting. Gideon noticed the cruel stares. A dark shadow passed over the weathered features of his face. He did not know this woman. He did not know why she was here instead of his promised bride. But the honor running deep in his veins could not tolerate the humiliation of a stranger. With a slow, deliberate step, Gideon closed the distance between them. He was perhaps the only man in the territory who could match her immense height and overwhelming physical power. He stepped purposefully to the side, positioning his massive frame directly between Elowen and the mocking eyes of the townspeople. The whispers died instantly. The townsfolk knew the reputation belonging to Gideon, the silent timber cutter who could fell a giant pine alone, and they wisely turned away. It was a small gesture, but the sudden shade of his protection caused a strange warmth to bloom inside the chest of Elowen. No man had ever stood between her and the cruelty of the world. They usually joined the laughter. "The wagon is this way," Gideon muttered, gesturing toward a heavy wooden buckboard hitched to 2 massive draft horses. He reached out his massive hand, offering to take the iron-bound trunk. Elowen hesitated. She was accustomed to carrying her own burdens. She was accustomed to carrying the burdens of everyone around her. But the dark eyes of the mountain man held no mockery. only a quiet, stoic patience. She slowly released her grip, allowing him to take the luggage. The trunk was terrifyingly heavy, filled with iron tools and heavy canvas, rather than delicate lace and fine dresses. Gideon felt the tremendous weight, yet he did not show any struggle. He simply hoisted it onto his broad shoulder, leading the way toward the horses. Elowen walked behind him, her heavy steps matching the slow, powerful rhythm of his stride. She noticed the clean, pressed fabric of his thermal shirt and the careful brushing of his leather suspenders. He had dressed with meticulous care for this day. He had prepared for a gentle bride, and the realization filled the heart of Elowen with a deep, aching guilt. They reached the wagon in silence. Gideon secured the trunk in the bed, then turned to assist her. He offered his hand. The hand belonging to Gideon was rough, scarred from years of brutal labor, yet the gesture was entirely gentle. Elowen looked at his open palm. She did not need help climbing into the wagon. Her legs were powerful enough to leap over the wooden side if she wished. Yet, the quiet dignity in his offer made her pause. Slowly, she placed her large, calloused hand inside his own. The contrast was startling. Two massive hands, both hardened by survival, meeting in the quiet dust of the frontier town. The grip belonging to Gideon was firm and respectful. He guided her up to the wooden bench, his presence acting as a solid anchor in a terrifying new world. Gideon walked to the front of the horses to check the heavy leather harnesses. The station master hurried across the platform, waving a yellow envelope containing the official travel documents. He handed the papers to Gideon, giving the giant woman in the wagon a wide, nervous glance before hurrying away. Gideon stood beside the front wheel, opening the envelope. The sun beat down on his broad shoulders as he unfolded the heavy parchment. He read the official registry seal. He read the origin of the train. Then, his dark eyes locked onto the name printed boldly across the bottom line. The rhythmic rubbing of his thumb stopped. His jaw tightened. He looked up slowly from the parchment, his gaze piercing through the rising dust to lock onto the stoic face of Elowen. The name on the travel papers did not match the name signed at the bottom of the letters he had cherished for 6 months. The woman sitting in his wagon was not merely a substitute. She was a complete mystery. He folded the paper, the rough sound of the parchment echoing in the tense silence. He stepped up onto the wagon bench, sitting beside her. The wooden seat groaned under the combined weight of two absolute giants. Gideon picked up the heavy leather reins, staring out toward the towering, snow-capped peaks of the distant mountains. Who was the woman sitting beside him? And what terrifying shadow had chased her all the way to the edge of the world? The wheels of the heavy wooden wagon ground against the loose gravel of the trail, leaving the judging eyes of the frontier town far behind. The path angled sharply upward into the deep timberline, cutting through ancient pines and towering shadows. The air grew instantly colder, biting through the thin canvas dress belonging to Elowen. She sat perfectly upright on the wooden bench, her immense shoulders squared, refusing to show any vulnerability. She waited for the giant man beside her to pull back the heavy leather reins, turn the massive draft horses around, and demand she march back down to the train station. That was the natural order of the world. People looked at the sheer size of her, saw the heavy muscle and the wild dust, and turned away. Yet, the mountain man simply kept his gaze fixed on the steep trail ahead. The silence between them stretched for miles. It was not the cruel, heavy silence of an angry father or a bitter employer. It was a thick, contemplative quiet. The rhythmic rubbing of his thumb against the side of his index finger returned. Gideon wrestled with the fragments of his shattered dream. He had built a life of quiet isolation up in the high peaks, surrounded by the towering pines, hoping a soft and delicate bride would fill the hollow spaces of his cabin. The massive, towering woman sitting beside him was a stark contrast to the dainty image he had painted in his mind. She was built for surviving harsh winters, not for wearing delicate lace. But as the wagon hit a deep rut, violently swaying the heavy frame, Elowen did not scream. She did not faint. She reached out her massive, calloused hand, gripping the iron rail with crushing force, perfectly balancing her weight to keep the buckboard from tipping. She was capable. She was quietly resilient. Gideon felt a strange flicker of profound respect take root beneath his ribs. The sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in deep bruises of purple and gold. The mountain wind howled down the rocky crags, slicing through the heavy fabric. A sudden shiver racked the muscular frame of Elowen. She tried to hide the tremor, pressing her arms tightly against her sides. Gideon noticed. He did not speak. He reached behind the wooden bench, retrieving a thick, woolen blanket woven in deep crimson and forest green. With one hand managing the massive draft horses, he used his free hand to drape the heavy wool over the broad shoulders of Elowen. The sudden warmth of the blanket was shocking. The slow, careful way he tucked the fabric around her arm carried a quiet reverence. No one had ever offered her comfort before. People always assumed her massive size made her impervious to the cold. The simple, silent kindness brought a sharp sting of moisture to the eyes of Elowen. She gripped the edge of the wool, pulling the warmth closer, wrapping the thick blanket around her chest. "Thank you," she breathed, the sound barely rising above the rhythmic clatter of the hooves. Gideon offered a slow, single nod. The gesture was small, but it bridged the vast emotional distance between them. A cautious curiosity began to replace the initial shock. The trail steepened dramatically. The sheer incline forced the horses to strain against the heavy leather harnesses. The massive muscles of the beasts bunched and trembled. Elowen instinctively placed her heavy boots against the floorboard, preparing to leap down into the thick mud to push the heavy wagon up the hill. She had always been the brute force required to move heavy burdens. Before she could stand, the massive hand of Gideon gently blocked her path. He pressed his open palm lightly against the heavy canvas of her sleeve, silently ordering her to remain seated. He leaned forward, clicking his tongue, holding the leather reins with masterful tension. He guided the beasts with a calm, undeniable authority, demanding their strength without raising his voice or wielding a whip. The horses surged forward, pulling the heavy wagon over the steepest crest. The heart of Elowen pounded against her ribs. He did not want her to labor like a common farmhand. He did not expect her to haul the wagon through the mud. The realization washed over her, creating a sudden, profound sense of safety. She was not merely a tool for heavy labor in the eyes of this giant. She was a passenger. They rode higher into the silent wilderness, the stars igniting across the black canvas of the night sky like scattered diamonds. The air smelled deeply of crushed pine needles, damp earth, and the sharp bite of impending frost. The world up here was isolated, terrifying, and utterly beautiful. The trees finally broke, revealing a wide, flat clearing bathed in the pale light of a rising moon. At the center of the clearing sat a large, magnificent cabin built from massive, hand-hewn logs. Warm yellow light glowed faintly from a lantern left burning in the window. The structure was an absolute fortress against the harsh world, a sanctuary carved directly out of the wild timber. Gideon brought the horses to a halt. He secured the heavy leather lines around the iron brake handle. He stepped down from the wagon, his massive boots hitting the solid earth with a heavy thud. He walked around to the side of the passenger, looking up at the towering woman, wrapped in the woolen blanket. He offered his large, scarred hand once again. Elowen accepted the gesture, allowing him to guide her down to the frost-covered ground. The wind whipped violently across the clearing, biting at their faces. Gideon pointed toward the heavy wooden door of the cabin, silently urging her to seek shelter while he unhitched the massive horses. Elowen walked up the thick wooden steps, pushing open the heavy door. The interior of the cabin was warm, smelling of wood smoke and dried herbs. The fire in the stone hearth had burned down to glowing red embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the plank floor. Elowen stepped inside, closing the heavy door behind her, shutting out the howling wind. The sudden quiet of the cabin was absolute. She slowly unwrapped the woolen blanket, letting the heavy fabric rest over the back of a large rocking chair. The home was impeccably clean. The large wooden table was scrubbed bare, and iron pots hung neatly near the hearth. The space reflected the lonely, disciplined life of the man outside. Elowen walked slowly across the room, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light. The embers cast a soft, orange glow over the far corner of the room. She stopped breathing. The blood chilled in her veins. Tucked deep into the darkest corner of the shadows, resting on two perfectly carved wooden rockers, was a tiny, meticulously crafted infant cradle. The wood was polished smooth, catching the faint light of the dying fire. A small, knitted blanket rested inside the empty basin. The travel papers had declared Gideon a lonely bachelor. The letters had spoken of an empty, solitary life in the high mountains. Yet, the small, cast, silent object sitting in the darkness suggested a devastating history he had hidden from the world. The heavy footsteps belonging to Gideon sounded on the porch outside. Why did a completely isolated mountain man keep an empty wooden cradle hidden in the dark? The pale light of dawn crept through the frost-covered window panes, casting a cold, blue glow across the heavy wooden planks of the cabin floor. Elowen woke before the sun fully breached the jagged peaks of the towering mountains. The habit of early rising was deeply etched into the very bones of Elowen. For her entire life, survival meant working before the master of the house awoke. A massive, towering woman who consumed more rations than a normal girl was only tolerated if she produced the brutal labor of 3 men. She slipped quietly from the narrow cot in the small side room, carefully avoiding the creaking floorboards. The air inside the cabin was freezing, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of the approaching winter. She wrapped a heavy woolen shawl around her broad shoulders and stepped out the back door into the biting mountain wind. The yard was dusted with a thin layer of white frost, sparkling under the pale morning light. Near the edge of the dark timberline sat a massive pile of uncut pine logs, and a heavy iron-splitting axe resting inside a scarred wooden stump. The handle of the axe was thick, carved from solid hickory, designed for the massive hands belonging to Gideon. Elowen did not hesitate. She crossed the frozen dirt, her heavy boots crunching softly in the absolute morning quiet. She grasped the thick hickory handle. The weight was immense, yet it felt perfectly balanced in her calloused palms. She hoisted the heavy iron head high above her broad shoulders, her thick muscles bunching beneath the faded canvas of her dress. With a terrifying, fluid motion, she brought the blade down. The iron struck the center of the massive pine log with a deafening crack, splitting the wood cleanly in two. The sharp scent of fresh pine sap instantly filled the frozen air. She did not stop. The rhythm of the labor consumed her completely. Lift. Swing. Crack. The pile of split firewood grew rapidly beside her. The physical exertion brought a familiar comfort, numbing the anxieties racing through her mind. She was deeply determined to prove her worth. She was terrified the mountain man would send her away if he realized she had absolutely nothing soft or delicate to offer. She could only offer brute strength. She would split the heavy wood. She would repair the broken fences. She would plow the hardened earth. She would buy her right to stay with the sheer power of her aching back. The cruel voices from her past echoed in her mind, reminding her she was nothing more than a beast of burden. The heavy wooden door of the cabin opened. Gideon stepped onto the back porch. He wore no heavy coat, only his thick thermal shirt and dark denim trousers. He stood perfectly still, watching the giant woman destroy the massive pine logs with terrifying efficiency. The absolute power radiating from her frame was awe-inspiring. Yet, the frantic, desperate pace of her swings revealed a deep, heartbreaking panic. He rubbed the rough edge of his thumb against the side of his index finger, a quiet gesture masking a profound storm of emotion. He recognized the raw fear driving her actions. She swung the heavy axe as if fighting for her very life, as if every split log was a desperate plea for shelter. He walked slowly down the wooden steps, his massive boots making no sound against the frozen earth. Elowen raised the heavy iron blade again, her breath rising in thick white plumes of steam against the freezing air. Before the heavy axe could descend, the massive hand, belonging to Gideon, wrapped firmly around the thick hickory handle, stopping the downward swing with effortless strength. Elowen froze. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. She looked up, fully expecting anger. She expected to be scolded for ruining his morning routine or overstepping her boundaries as a stranger in his home. The dark eyes of Gideon held no anger. They held a deep, quiet sorrow. With a gentle, slow motion, he pulled the heavy axe from her tight grip. He did not wrench the tool away. He simply took the heavy burden, burying the iron head deep into the scarred wooden stump. "You are not a hired hand," Gideon murmured, his voice a low, steady rumble that vibrated pleasantly through the freezing morning air. Elowen stared at the massive pile of split wood, her broad chest heaving, the cold sweat shining on her brow. She swallowed hard, struggling to suppress the rising tide of panic threatening to consume her. "I must earn my keep," Elowen breathed, her voice trembling slightly in the cold. "I am not delicate. I am not a proper lady. I can only offer the heavy labor of my hands." Gideon stepped closer. The sheer size of his towering frame blocked the biting mountain wind, creating a sudden pocket of warmth. He looked down at the large, calloused hands belonging to Elowen. They were rough, they were heavily scarred, and covered in sticky pine sap. They were the hands of a true survivor. He reached out, pulling a soft cloth from the pocket of his trousers. With a quiet, deliberate tenderness, he began to wipe the sticky pine sap from her massive palms. The gesture was utterly shocking. The gentle, caring pressure of his touch sent a profound warmth rushing through the frozen veins of Elowen. It was a warmth she had never known. "This is a home," Gideon stated softly, his dark eyes never leaving her shocked face. "A home is not earned with blood and sweat. A home is shared." He released her hands and turned toward the cabin. He returned a moment later carrying a large tin cup steaming with dark, hot coffee. He offered the cup to Elowen, gently wrapping his massive hands over her own rough fingers to steady the hot vessel. The intense heat radiating from the tin seeped deep into her chilled bones, chasing away the bitter frost. The bitter. Rich smell of roasted beans grounded her racing thoughts. It was the third time in 2 days he had offered her comfort, without demanding brutal labor in return. The heavy, roughened, protective boundaries she had built around her scarred heart began to soften, melting like the morning frost beneath the rising sun. Gideon gestured gently toward the warmth of the open door, absolutely refusing to let her remain out in the freezing cold. The silent battle of wills was entirely over. He had conquered her stubborn pride through sheer, unrelenting gentleness. Elowen turned slowly to walk back up the wooden steps. As she moved toward the door, she reached into the deep pocket of her heavy canvas dress to retrieve a small handkerchief to wipe her brow. The thick fabric of her pocket caught awkwardly on her fingers. A small, heavy object slipped from the opening, falling toward the wooden planks. The object hit the hard wood of the porch with a sharp, metallic clatter. The delicate silver hinge broke open upon impact, exposing the secret hidden inside. Gideon stepped forward immediately to retrieve the fallen item. He reached down, picking up the tarnished silver locket from the cold floorboards. The small, oval casing lay open in his massive palm. Inside the delicate silver frame rested a faded, hand-painted portrait. Gideon stared intently at the tiny painting. The man depicted in the portrait possessed cold, cruel eyes and a twisted, sneering smile. The face radiated absolute malice and harsh authority, creating a stark, disturbing contrast to the quiet dignity of the giant woman standing before him. The image carried the heavy weight of a dark history. The rhythmic rubbing of his thumb stopped completely. His jaw tightened. He looked slowly from the cruel face in the silver locket up to the terrified, wide eyes of Elowen. She stood frozen on the porch, her breath caught in her throat. Who was the man in the silver case? And what terrifying darkness had he inflicted upon the giant woman, desperately seeking refuge on this isolated mountain? The silence on the wooden porch felt heavier than the massive pine logs resting in the frozen yard. Elowen stood absolutely still, the cold morning wind biting through the thin canvas of her dress. Her heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She waited for the inevitable interrogation. She waited for the mountain man to demand the truth about the cruel face hidden inside the silver locket. She knew the dark eyes belonging to Gideon saw the malice painted into the tiny portrait. Gideon looked at the painted face of the cruel man, then slowly raised his gaze to meet the terrified eyes of Elowen. The rhythmic rubbing of his thumb against his index finger slowed, then stopped completely. He closed the delicate silver casing with a soft, metallic click. He did not ask a single question. He did not demand an explanation. With a gentle, deliberate motion, he reached out and pressed the tarnished silver locket back into the large, calloused palm belonging to Elowen. He closed her rough fingers over the metal, offering a quiet nod of absolute understanding. He respected the deep, hidden wounds she carried. He would not tear down her walls by force. The quiet dignity of his restraint washed over Elowen like a warm river, melting the icy terror gripping her chest. She slipped the locket deep into her pocket, bowing her head in profound, unspoken gratitude. Before either of them could move back toward the warmth of the cabin, a violent shadow swept across the frosty yard. The pale morning light vanished instantly. Elowen looked up toward the jagged peaks. A massive wall of black, bruised clouds rolled over the towering granite summits, swallowing the rising sun entirely. The temperature plummeted in a matter of seconds. The deep, heavy scent of raw ozone and crushed ice filled the air. A terrifying wind howled down through the ancient timberline, bending the massive pine trees until the thick trunks groaned in protest. Gideon turned his massive frame toward the sky, his jaw tightening. He recognized the brutal speed of the high mountain squalls. This was not a gentle winter snow. This was a tearing, violent wind capable of ripping the heavy wooden shingles right off the outbuildings. "The roof of the barn will not hold," Gideon shouted over the screaming wind, pointing toward the massive wooden structure resting at the edge of the clearing. The upper beam tore loose during the last freeze. He did not wait for a reply. He sprinted across the frozen dirt, his heavy boots pounding against the hardened earth. Elowen did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She followed him into the howling storm, her long, powerful legs eating up the distance between the cabin and the barn. They pushed through the heavy wooden doors just as the first massive drops of freezing rain began to hammer against the timber. The interior of the barn was dark and smelled deeply of sweet hay and old leather. The wind ripped through the massive gaps in the upper loft, shaking the entire structure with terrifying violence. Gideon rushed toward the wooden ladder leading up to the high rafters. He climbed with rapid, powerful movements, reaching the exposed upper platform. Elowen climbed directly behind him, refusing to stay safely on the ground. When she reached the high loft, the sheer force of the wind nearly knocked her backward. A massive, heavy support beam hung precariously from the central rafter, swinging violently on a single rusted iron bolt. If the beam fell, the entire eastern side of the roof would collapse under the storm. Gideon stepped out onto the narrow wooden planking, reaching up to grasp the swinging timber. The wood was incredibly heavy, soaked with freezing rain and dense with age. He planted his heavy boots against the wooden floorboards, wrapping his massive arms around the thick timber. He pushed upward, his massive shoulders straining against the tremendous weight and the brutal force of the howling wind. The heavy muscles of his back bunched tightly beneath the fabric of his thermal shirt. He needed to lift the beam high enough to slide a new iron carriage bolt through the bracket. But the wind fought him relentlessly, pushing the heavy wood back down. He could not hold the tremendous weight and reach the iron bolt at the same time. Suddenly, a pair of massive, deeply calloused hands clamped onto the heavy wet wood directly beside his own. Elowen stepped into the freezing rain, whipping through the open roof. She braced her powerful legs against the heavy floorboards, her broad shoulders squaring beneath her soaked canvas dress. She did not ask for permission. She did not wait for an instruction. She simply looked at the heavy timber, matched the rhythm of his breathing, and unleashed the absolute, overwhelming physical power hidden within her towering frame. Together, the two giants pushed upward. The massive wooden beam moved. The heavy burden that would have crushed a normal man became entirely manageable when shared between two souls possessing such monumental strength. The physical coordination between them was absolutely breathtaking. They moved in perfect, unspoken harmony. Elowen felt the slight shift in the footing belonging to Gideon, and she instantly adjusted her own stance to compensate for the weight. They operated like two halves of a single, unstoppable force. Gideon looked at the towering woman standing beside him, her face soaked with freezing rain, her jaw set with pure determination. A profound wave of admiration crashed through his chest. A delicate, fragile bride would have perished in this storm. A soft woman would have hidden in the cabin. But the fierce, giant survivor standing beside him was holding the very roof over his head. "Hold the weight," Gideon yelled over the deafening roar of the wind. "I have it," Elowen roared back, locking her heavy arms and taking the full brunt of the massive timber. Gideon released one hand, reaching into his heavy leather belt to retrieve the thick iron carriage bolt. He slammed the metal through the wooden bracket, securing the heavy beam to the central rafter. He quickly spun the heavy iron nut onto the threads, locking the structure in place. The roof stabilized instantly. The violent shaking of the loft ceased. Elowen stepped back from the edge, her chest heaving, her breath rising in thick white clouds. She looked at Gideon, expecting a nod of dismissal. Instead, she found his dark eyes locked onto her face, filled with absolute, unfiltered awe. In the heart of the violent storm, they had stood on entirely equal footing. She was not a beast of burden meant to be worked to death. She was a partner. The realization struck Elowen with a force far more powerful than the howling wind. For the very first time in her life, her immense size and terrifying strength were not a curse, but a true blessing. Suddenly, the wind tore a jagged piece of loose iron roofing from the edge of the loft. The sharp, rusted metal spun violently through the air, hurtling directly toward the face belonging to Gideon. Elowen reacted with lightning speed. She lunged forward, throwing her massive arm up to block the flying metal. The heavy iron struck her forearm, deflecting away harmlessly into the hay below. The violent, sudden extension of her arm caused Elowen to wince in blinding agony. A sharp, terrifying gasp escaped her lips. The heavy canvas of her soaked dress caught against the rough wooden post, tearing violently down the seam of her right shoulder. The wet fabric peeled back, exposing the heavy, deeply muscled flesh of her upper back and shoulder to the freezing rain. Gideon stepped forward to pull her away from the edge, reaching out to check her arm for injury. He froze completely. The breath caught painfully in his throat. Stretching aggressively across the heavy muscle of her shoulder blade was a massive, jagged, terrifying scar. The flesh was twisted and pale, a brutal, horrifying testament to a trauma that no human being should have ever survived. It was not a wound earned from a simple farm accident. It was a vicious, deliberate mark of absolute cruelty. Gideon stared at the massive, faded wound, his blood turning to ice. What horrific monster had inflicted such unspeakable damage upon the giant woman? And how had she managed to survive the agony of such a devastating blow? The freezing rain hammered relentlessly against the thick wooden planks of the high loft, creating a deafening, brutal roar. Gideon stood completely still at the edge of the open roof, his breath suspended in his chest. The violent wind ripped through the barn, yet he felt entirely frozen. He stared at the massive, jagged scar stretching across the exposed shoulder belonging to Elowen. The pale dapper, twisted tissue was a brutal map of sheer agony, a permanent record of a violence no human being should ever endure. Elowen squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the familiar reaction. She knew how terrifying her scarred, massive body appeared to the world. She braced herself for the disgust, the pity, or the quiet revulsion that always followed when people saw the ruin of her skin. She instinctively reached up, desperately trying to pull the torn, wet canvas of her dress over the horrific mark. Gideon did not show disgust. He did not turn away. Instead, the dark eyes of the mountain man softened into a pool of profound, aching sorrow. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Without a single word, he reached up and unbuttoned the heavy thermal overshirt from his own massive chest. He stripped the warm fabric away, standing in only his undershirt against the biting cold. With absolute, unwavering gentleness, he draped the dry, heavy thermal shirt over the shivering shoulders of Elowen, carefully covering the torn canvas and the terrible scar. The fabric carried the deep, comforting warmth of his body. The simple, protective gesture completely shattered the terrifying anxiety gripping the heart of Elowen. He placed his large hand gently against the center of her back, guiding her away from the dangerous edge of the loft. They descended the heavy wooden ladder, matching their steps in the dark, roaring space of the barn. Once their heavy boots touched the solid dirt floor, Gideon pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The storm outside had escalated into an absolute tempest. The wind howled with demonic fury, driving the freezing rain horizontally across the yard. They sprinted across the frozen mud, two massive giants leaning against the sheer force of the gale. They reached the wooden porch, and Gideon threw his massive shoulder against the heavy cabin door, shoving it open against the wind. They tumbled inside, and he quickly slammed the thick wood shut, sliding the heavy iron bolt into place. The sudden silence within the cabin was a profound relief. The sanctuary of the home wrapped around them like a physical embrace. The air inside was rapidly cooling. Gideon immediately moved toward the stone hearth. He seized the heavy iron poker, stirring the dying orange embers into life, tossing thick logs of dry birch and pine onto the grate. Within moments, a roaring, brilliant fire blazed to life, casting a rich, golden warmth across the room. The deep, familiar scent of wood smoke and dried herbs chased away the metallic bite of the ozone. Elowen stood near the wooden table, shivering violently as the adrenaline faded from her bloodstream. The heavy canvas dress was soaked completely through, clinging to the thick muscles of her frame. Gideon turned from the fire. He walked to the heavy wooden washstand, pouring hot water from the iron kettle into a clean ceramic basin. He retrieved a soft cotton towel and a small glass jar filled with pale, fragrant ointment. He carried the items to the low wooden table, situated directly in front of the roaring fire. He placed a thick, padded chair near the hearth, gesturing silently for Elowen to sit. She moved slowly, lowering her towering frame into the chair. The intense heat from the flames washed over her frozen skin, creating a deep, bone-melting comfort. Gideon sat on a low wooden stool across from her. He dipped the clean cotton towel into the steaming basin, wringing out the excess water. He offered the warm cloth to Elowen, his dark eyes radiating pure respect. He did not try to touch the torn fabric of her dress. He afforded her absolute privacy and dignity. Elowen took the steaming cloth, pressing the magnificent warmth against her frozen face and neck. The gentleness, quiet care radiating from the giant man sitting across from her was entirely overwhelming. She had spent her entire existence providing heavy labor. Yet, here, in the heart of a violent storm, she was being tended to like something precious. She lowered the cloth. The rhythmic rubbing of his thumb against the side of his index finger returned. Gideon watched the leaping orange flames, giving her the silent space to breathe, absolutely refusing to demand an explanation for the scar. The silence was not an interrogation. It was an open, safe harbor. Elowen looked at the leaping fire, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. The walls she had built around her soul felt fragile in the overwhelming warmth of the cabin. She needed him to know she was not a monster. She needed him to understand the violence carved into her flesh. The man in the silver locket, Elowen breathed, her voice trembling slightly, blending with the crackle of the burning birch. He was a man who collected debts. He owned the land beneath our feet, and he demanded payment in blood when the coins ran out. Gideon stopped rubbing his thumb. He turned his head slowly, locking his gaze onto the face of Elowen. He listened with absolute, unwavering focus. I was built large, Even as a young girl, Elowen continued, staring down at her heavily calloused hands. I was a giant clumsy thing, fit only for pulling heavy plows and lifting stones. But there was someone else in the house. Someone very small. Someone fragile and terrified. She swallowed hard, the painful memories burning her throat. The cruel man raised a heavy iron rod to strike the fragile one, Elowen whispered, a single tear slipping down her dusty cheek. I could not let the metal fall upon a delicate frame. I stepped between them. I took the blow so the iron would not shatter a delicate life. The silence in the cabin stretched, deep and profound. The storm screamed outside the thick wooden walls. Yet inside, the world stood entirely still. Gideon looked at the massive, powerful woman sitting before him. He did not see a beast of burden. He did not see a terrifying giant. He saw an absolute guardian. He understood the profound, sacred duty of the strong to shield the weak. He had spent his own life building a fortress in the mountains, trying to protect the fragile things he had ultimately failed to save. He leaned forward, resting his massive elbows on his knees. You are a shield, Gideon murmured, his voice thick with raw emotion. There is no shame in the scars earned while protecting the innocent. You carry the mark of true honor. The breath hitched violently in the chest of Elowen. No one had ever called her honorable. No one had ever viewed her massive size and terrible scars as anything other than a curse. The profound validation from the stoic mountain man struck the deepest, most broken corner of her soul, planting a magnificent seed of healing intimacy. She looked up, meeting his dark, soulful eyes. For the very first time in her life, she felt truly seen. She felt incredibly safe. Before either of them could speak another word, a deafening, unnatural crash shattered the quiet sanctuary. The terrifying sound did not come from the howling wind or the heavy thunder. It was the horrific sound of massive, ancient timber rending and tearing, followed by a violent tremor that shook the very foundations of the cabin. Gideon shot to his feet, instantly grabbing the heavy iron rifle, resting above the stone mantel. What massive, destructive force had the violently raging storm dragged down from the jagged peaks to their doorstep? The heavy iron rifle belonging to Gideon rested firmly against his massive shoulder. He stood between Elowen and the heavy wooden door, his feet planted wide on the wooden planks of the floor. He did not flinch. His dark eyes remained locked on the thick timber of the barricaded entrance. The violent shudder passing through the cabin slowly faded, leaving only the relentless, howling roar of the mountain storm outside. Whatever had struck the earth outside was massive, but it had missed the main house. We wait for the dawn, Gideon commanded softly, lowering the heavy iron barrel toward the floorboards. The darkness hides too many dangers. We will not risk the freezing wind until the sun breaks the timberline. Elowen offered a slow, steady nod. The terrifying adrenaline slowly left her heavy muscles, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. They spent the remainder of the long, dark night sitting near the roaring fire. The profound safety of the cabin wrapped around them. Gideon remained vigilant, adding thick logs of birch to the iron grate. Elowen eventually drifted into a restless slumber in the heavy padded chair, the thick thermal shirt belonging to Gideon still providing a magnificent, protective warmth over her torn dress. The violent howling of the wind finally ceased, just as the first pale light of morning pierced the frost-covered window panes. Gideon unlatched the heavy iron bolt. He pushed the thick wooden door open. The freezing morning air rushed into the cabin, carrying the sharp, overwhelming scent of crushed pine needles, shattered timber, and wet earth. Elowen stepped onto the wooden porch beside him. The destruction left behind by the brutal tempest was absolute. A massive, ancient pine tree from the edge of the clearing had surrendered to the violent gale. The tremendous roots were torn completely free from the rocky earth. The colossal trunk lay directly across the yard, having crashed violently into the heavy wooden supply shed. The thick roof of the outbuilding was completely crushed under the sheer, devastating weight of the fallen giant. The wooden walls groaned under the immense pressure, threatening to collapse entirely. The winter rations belonging to Gideon were trapped inside. The heavy sacks of flour, the cured meats, and the vital root vegetables were in immediate danger of being buried under a mountain of splintered timber and freezing mud. Gideon walked silently down the wooden steps, his heavy boots sinking deeply into the freezing mire of the yard. He approached the massive fallen pine. He placed his thick, heavily calloused hands against the rough bark, bracing his massive shoulders against the trunk. He drove his boots into the mud, unleashing the tremendous power of his back and legs. The thick timber groaned in protest, but the massive tree did not shift a single inch. The sheer weight was entirely too much for one man to move, even a man possessing the monumental strength of the mountain giant. He stepped back, his chest heaving. The rhythmic rubbing of his thumb against the side of his index finger returned. He calculated the hours required to cut the massive tree into pieces using the heavy two-man saw. The shed would surely collapse before the labor was finished. He heard the heavy, steady sound of boots stepping into the mud behind him. Elowen walked directly into the freezing slop of the ruined yard. She did not hesitate to soil the hem of her heavy canvas dress. She did not complain about the biting morning frost. She moved with quiet, undeniable purpose, stepping directly to the opposite side of the massive trunk. She bent her long, powerful legs, planting her heavy boots firmly into the earth. She slid her thick, wildly muscular arms beneath the rough bark of the fallen pine. "On your count," Elowen breathed. Her voice, a low, steady rumble of absolute determination. Gideon stared at her, across the massive expanse of the fallen tree. The pale morning light caught the sheer, breathtaking power of her broad shoulders and the fierce, unyielding courage burning in her green eyes. How a sudden, profound revelation struck the deepest part of his soul, shattering his lingering prejudice into 1,000 meaningless pieces. He had spent 6 lonely months dreaming of a fragile, delicate bride. He had wanted a soft creature to protect from the harsh realities of the world. But as he looked at the ruined shed and the massive, crushing weight of the wilderness, threatening his very survival, he realized the terrifying truth. A fragile, delicate woman would have been completely useless in this brutal reality. A soft bride would have been sitting inside the cabin, weeping by the fire, entirely incapable of facing the devastating aftermath of the storm. The towering, wildly muscular guardian standing opposite him was not a cruel mistake. She was a magnificent, unparalleled blessing. She was exactly what he needed to survive the harshness of the world. Gideon matched her stance, sliding his massive arms under the wood. "Lift," he commanded. They unleashed their combined, monumental strength simultaneously. The heavy muscles of their backs bunched and strained. The massive tree shifted. They roared against the crushing weight, pushing upward with everything they possessed. The heavy trunk lifted from the splintered roof of the shed. "Walk it backward," Gideon shouted, his boots slipping slightly in the mud. Elowen held the tremendous burden, perfectly matching his heavy steps. They moved the colossal pine entirely off the ruined structure, dropping the heavy timber onto the muddy earth with a deafening, teepin', earth-shaking thud. They stood panting in the freezing air, their chests heaving in perfect unison. Elowen looked across the massive log, expecting a stern command to begin salvaging the goods. Instead, Gideon looked at her with an expression of absolute, unfiltered awe. He walked slowly around the fallen tree. He reached out, gently wiping a streak of freezing mud from her cheek with his rough thumb. The quiet, incredibly tender gesture sent a powerful shockwave of warmth straight through her exhausted body. They spent the next 2 hours quietly salvaging the untouched provisions from the ruined shed. When the labor was finished, Gideon led her back into the warmth of the cabin. He poured hot, strong coffee into the iron cups, offering her the warming brew before he took a single sip for himself. The shared silence between them was no longer filled with caution. It was filled with deep, undeniable admiration. The peace of the morning was suddenly broken by the heavy, rhythmic splashing of approaching hooves. Gideon stood from the wooden table, looking through the frost-covered glass of the front window. A stranger on a dark horse rode slowly into the clearing, the coat of the animal heavy with freezing mud. The man wore the heavy blue uniform of a telegraph messenger. The rider stopped near the porch, pulling a yellow envelope from his leather saddlebag. "I carry an urgent message from the east," the stranger shouted over the morning wind. "I am seeking the bride. I have a telegram requiring the immediate attention of Miss Clara." The hot coffee sloshed over the edge of the iron cup as the massive hands belonging to Elowen trembled violently. The terrifying secret she carried had finally climbed the mountain. The yellow envelope in the hand of the rider seemed to absorb all the light in the freezing morning. Elowen stared at the tiny square of paper through the frost-covered window panes. Her massive hands trembled violently, sloshing the hot, dark coffee over the rim of the iron cup. The steaming liquid splashed against the thick wooden planks of the floor, but she did not feel the heat. A terrifying coldness gripped the center of her chest, freezing the very blood in her veins. "Miss Clara," the messenger shouted again, the breath of the tired horse pluming in the bitter air. "I carry a legal demand for Miss Clara." The name struck Elowen like the heavy iron-splitting axe. Clara, the fragile sister. The beautiful, delicate girl who was supposed to travel west, leaving the heavy, this ugly giant behind to bear the brutal consequences of the family debt. Elowen slowly set the iron cup upon the heavy wooden table. The brief, beautiful sanctuary she had found within the walls of this mountain cabin was officially over. The world had found her. The punishment she deserved for stealing the identity of her sister had finally arrived. She turned away from the window, her broad shoulders slumping under the crushing weight of her reality. She needed to pack the heavy canvas trunk. She needed to surrender to the rider and return to the cruel men waiting in the east. Before she could take a single step toward the small side room, the massive frame belonging to Gideon blocked her path. He did not look at the messenger outside. He looked entirely at the terrified face of Elowen. He saw the profound, devastating panic shattering the quiet strength she had displayed only moments ago. He saw a giant woman preparing to march directly toward an execution. The rhythmic rubbing of his thumb against the side of his index finger started. A slow, deliberate motion measuring the severity of the threat. He reached out. He placed his massive, calloused hand gently against the heavy canvas, covering her thick arm. The warmth of his palm anchored her to the floorboards, pulling her back from the edge of absolute despair. "Stay inside the cabin," Gideon commanded softly, his voice leaving absolutely no room for argument. He turned and walked to the heavy wooden door. He pulled the thick timber open, stepping out onto the freezing porch. He did not invite the rider inside. He stood at the top of the wooden steps. A towering, terrifying guardian made of heavy muscle and raw mountain fury. He folded his massive arms across his broad chest, staring down at the stranger sitting upon the exhausted horse. "Speak your business," Gideon rumbled, the sound carrying the heavy, warning tone of an approaching avalanche. The messenger shifted uncomfortably in the leather saddle, clearly intimidated by the sheer size of the mountain man. "I hold a telegram from the eastern banks," the rider replied, waving the yellow envelope. "The family belonging to the bride has defaulted on a massive debt. The original agreement is void. The creditors demand the immediate return of Miss Clara to face the legal consequences, or they will send collectors up the mountain to reclaim the cost of the travel." Elowen stood in the shadow of the doorway, her heart shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The debt collectors were the cruel men from the silver locket. They would drag her back. They would force her into brutal labor until her heavy bones finally snapped under the strain. She closed her eyes, preparing to step past Gideon and offer her wrists to the messenger. The heavy boot belonging to Gideon shifted backward, subtly blocking the doorway so she could not pass. It was a profound, deeply protective movement. He was shielding her from the harshness of the world, exactly as she had shielded the fragile sister from the falling iron rod. "The woman inside my home belongs on this mountain," Gideon stated firmly, the absolute certainty in his voice echoing through the freezing clearing. "She is under my protection. You will return to the valley. You will tell the eastern banks they have absolutely no claim here." The rider blinked in surprise. "Sir, the law demands the return of the bride. The collectors are brutal men. They will not respect your claim over the woman." "Let them climb the mountain," Gideon answered, his dark eyes narrowing into dangerous, unyielding slits. "They will find the high rocks highly inhospitable. Now, leave the paper and get off my land." The overwhelming authority, radiating from the giant timber cutter, broke the remaining resolve of the messenger. The rider tossed the yellow envelope onto the muddy earth, pulled the leather reins tightly, and spurred the dark horse back down the steep, freezing trail. The sound of the heavy hooves faded into the thick timberline. Gideon walked slowly down the wooden steps. He reached into the freezing mud, picking up the soiled yellow envelope. He stared at the name printed boldly across the front. He remembered the name signed at the bottom of the long, delicate letters he had read by the fire for 6 long months. He remembered the massive, towering woman sitting beside him in the wagon, possessing a completely different name on her travel documents. He turned and walked back up to the porch. He stepped inside the warmth of the cabin, closing the heavy wooden door firmly behind him. The thick iron bolt slid into place with a definitive, ringing finality. He turned to face Elowen. She stood near the stone hearth, trembling violently despite the roaring fire. The heavy canvas dress hung limply over her muscular frame. The beautiful illusion of safety was entirely gone. She knew the stoic, honorable man standing before her would never tolerate a thief or a liar in his home. He had protected her from the stranger, but he could not protect her from the brutal consequences of her own deception. Gideon walked toward the heavy wooden table. He placed the muddy yellow envelope beside the steaming iron cups of dark coffee. He did not yell. He did not show any anger. He simply stood tall, his massive chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. He looked deeply into the terrified green eyes of the giant woman. He saw the profound ocean of pain and fear swirling behind her gaze. He had recognized her absolute physical power. He had validated her silent dignity. He had witnessed her sacred courage in the heart of the storm. But he did not know her truth. "I require the absolute truth," Gideon murmured, his voice rumbling softly through the quiet room. I need to know the name of the woman standing in my home. I need to know why the shadow of the East is hunting you across the continent. Elowen swallowed hard, the terrifying lump of absolute panic rising in her throat. She had built her entire survival upon silence and brute strength. Confessing the truth meant exposing the most vulnerable, fragile corners of her battered soul to the very man she desperately wanted to keep. Will she risk losing the only true sanctuary she has ever known by finally confessing the massive deception? The heavy silence within the cabin felt completely suffocating. The fire in the stone hearth crackled fiercely, throwing long, dancing shadows across the rugged face belonging to Gideon. He stood completely still, waiting for the truth. Elowen looked at the yellow envelope resting on the wooden table. Her massive chest heaved with a slow, agonizing breath. The fortress of silence she had built around her soul began to crack. She felt the incredible warmth of the thick thermal shirt belonging to Gideon still resting across her broad shoulders, a physical reminder of the safety she was about to destroy. "My name is Elowen," she whispered, her voice breaking under the immense weight of the confession. "Clara is the sister belonging to me. The delicate, beautiful sister." Gideon did not interrupt. He watched the heavy tears pool in her striking green eyes. The rhythmic rubbing of his thumb against the side of his index finger began, a slow and deliberate measurement of the unfolding reality. "The men from the eastern banks demanded payment," Elowen continued, her voice gaining a desperate, quiet strength. "The cruel man in the silver locket owned the debt. He told the family we must surrender Clara to him, to work in his terrible house until the coin was replaced." Clara was terrified. She wept for days. The train ticket west was meant to be her escape. "You sent the money for the travel. You offered a safe harbor." Elowen swallowed the bitter knot of fear in her throat. The deep, rich smell of roasted coffee filled the room, a sharp contrast to the absolute terror freezing her veins. But when the morning of the departure arrived, Clara collapsed. She lacked the courage to board the train. She could not face the unknown wilderness. The men were coming for her. The debt was due. So, I took the heavy cloak belonging to her. I took the travel papers. I boarded the train in the place of Clara. She finally raised her eyes to meet the dark, piercing gaze belonging to the mountain man. "I knew you wanted a delicate bride," Elowen breathed, a heavy tear spilling over her dust-covered cheek. "I knew I was a giant, ugly beast of burden. I expected you to send me away the moment I stepped off the train. But I needed to draw the cruel men away from Clara. I needed them to follow the name on the ticket. I needed to become the prey so the fragile one could hide. I deceived you to save the blood belonging to my family." The absolute, Hipson's devastating honesty hung in the warm air of the cabin. She stood before him entirely stripped of her armor, waiting for the righteous anger of a man who had been completely deceived. She prepared her heavy muscles to pack her belongings. She prepared her heart to leave the only true home she had ever known. Gideon stepped forward. He did not shout. He did not show any betrayal. He reached out with quiet, undeniable purpose, placing his large, heavily calloused hands upon the broad shoulders belonging to Elowen. The profound warmth of his touch anchored her trembling frame to the wooden floorboards. The paradigm shift inside the soul of Gideon was absolute and deeply transformative. For 6 lonely months, he had stared at the empty wooden cradle, hidden in the dark corner of the room. He had convinced himself that a soft, delicate woman would somehow mend the quiet tragedy of his past. He had believed he needed a fragile creature to protect, a gentle flower to bring warmth to the freezing stones of his solitary existence. He had sought an illusion of perfect domesticity to cover the deep, aching grief residing in his chest. But as he looked at Elowen, the towering Nathestra, wildly muscular survivor who had held the heavy roof of the barn in the heart of the storm, he realized the profound foolishness of his dream. A delicate flower would have perished in this harsh wilderness. A fragile bride would have abandoned him the moment the bitter winter winds began to howl. A soft woman would have shattered under the terrible weight of the mountain isolation. He did not need a soft creature to protect. He needed an equal. He needed a fierce guardian who understood the brutal cost of survival. He needed the magnificent giant standing for him. A woman possessing the incredible courage to sacrifice her own life for the safety of another. The rhythmic rubbing of his thumb stopped completely. He looked directly into the terrified green eyes belonging to the giant woman. "You are not a beast of burden," Gideon murmured, his voice thick with a profound, earth-shattering reverence. "You are the bravest soul I have ever encountered," Elowen gasped softly, her broad shoulders shaking as the unexpected validation washed over her scarred heart. She had prepared for total rejection. She received absolute admiration. The terrible anxiety suffocating her chest began to dissolve, replaced by a magnificent, fragile hope. "The letters from Clara were beautiful," Gideon stated, his dark eyes burning with absolute sincerity. "But they were written by a ghost. The words belonged to a woman who lacked the courage to face the storm. I do not want the ghost. I want the fierce, loyal giant standing in my home. I want the woman who stood beside me in the freezing rain." He gently raised his rough hand, wiping the single tear from the cheek belonging to Elowen. "I choose you, Elowen," he breathed, the sound of her true name falling from his lips feeling like a magnificent sunrise. The heavy, suffocating weight of her deception completely shattered. The second chance they both desperately needed was standing right in front of them, forged in shared hardship and profound mutual respect. Elowen let out a quiet, shuddering breath, her entire body relaxing into the powerful, protective presence belonging to the mountain man. Gideon turned slowly back toward the heavy wooden table. He picked up the muddy yellow envelope containing the telegram from the eastern banks. He did not care about the legal demands of a cruel world. He walked directly to the stone hearth and tossed the paper into the roaring fire. They stood together in quiet solidarity, watching the brilliant orange flames consume the bitter reminder of the past. The yellow paper curled and blackened, turning into fragile gray ash. The past belonging to Clara was dead. The future belonging to Elowen was finally beginning. But the past never surrenders without demanding a final payment. As the yellow envelope burned, the heavy telegram inside slipped slightly from the ashes, exposing the final typed line before the flames could devour the black ink entirely. Gideon caught sight of the dark letters resting against the glowing red coals. His massive jaw tightened into absolute, unyielding stone. The breath caught painfully in his chest. The message did not merely demand the return of the bride. The final sentence contained a chilling, undeniable promise written by the cruel man from the silver locket. The debt collectors were already traveling through the territory, and they would arrive at the mountain cabin by the end of the current week. The fragile gray ash floated up the dark stone chimney, disappearing into the cold morning air. The terrifying promise written by the cruel man from the east lingered in the quiet cabin, a dark shadow, threatening to consume the magnificent light they had just discovered. The men were coming. They had 6 days to prepare for the arrival of the debt collectors. Gideon did not panic. He turned slowly from the blazing hearth, his massive chest rising with a calm, deliberate breath. He did not suggest she pack her belongings. He did not tell her to run and hide in the deep timberline. The Profound, transformative bond forged between the two giants the previous night was utterly unbreakable. They would not surrender the sanctuary they had found in one another. They would stand together against the harshness of the world. The following days brought a grueling, beautiful rhythm of shared labor. They did not spend the week pacing the wooden floorboards in fear. Instead, they chose to fortify the homestead, putting their combined, monumental strength into a deeply symbolic task. Gideon had long planned to build a winter greenhouse against the southern stone wall of the property, to construct a warm glass harbor where delicate green life could survive. The brutal mountain winter was a profound act of defiance against the approaching darkness. It was the absolute manifestation of creating life from hardship. Elowen understood the silent magnitude of the work. Every heavy stone she carried for the foundation, every thick pine board she held in place, felt like an unspoken promise of a shared future. She was no longer performing brutal labor to earn her keep or pay off a cruel debt. She was building her own home. The realization filled the battered soul belonging to Elowen with a breathtaking, radiant peace. The physical coordination between them grew into a magnificent, silent dance. They worked under the crisp blue sky of the high peaks, surrounded by the sharp scent of fresh sawdust and turned mountain earth. Elowen lifted the massive rocks for the foundation walls, her heavy muscles bunching effortlessly beneath her canvas dress. She felt absolutely no shame in her terrifying strength. The dark eyes belonging to Gideon followed her movements, filled with nothing but pure, unadulterated admiration. During the afternoon of the third day, Gideon approached the massive trench Elowen was digging. He carried a heavy iron canteen filled with cold mountain spring water. He offered the vessel to her. As she reached out, he gently stopped her bare, calloused hands. He pulled a pair of thick, durable leather-work gloves from his heavy tool belt. He had spent the entire evening sitting by the fire, meticulously modifying the heavy leather with a sharp needle and thick thread, expanding the fingers to perfectly fit the massive hands belonging to the giant woman. "The rocks are sharp," Gideon murmured softly, placing the customized leather gloves into her open palms. "You must protect your strength." The deeply tender gesture caused a profound warmth to rush through the chest of Elowen. She slipped the heavy gloves onto her large hands. They fit flawlessly. It was a tangible, undeniable proof that he truly saw her, accepted her massive size, and cared deeply for her comfort. She looked up at the towering mountain man, her green eyes shining with immense gratitude. "Thank you," Elowen breathed, her voice trembling slightly with overwhelming emotion. They sat together on the edge of the newly laid stone foundation, passing the iron canteen back and forth. The cold water tasted sweet and pure. The rhythmic rubbing of his thumb against the side of his index finger returned, as Gideon surveyed the framing they had completed. He was not measuring the danger of the East. He was measuring the exact dimensions of their shared destiny. The quiet, profound safety vibrating between them was a magnificent sanctuary, far stronger than the heavy logs of the main cabin. By the dawn of the sixth day, the intricate wooden skeleton of the winter greenhouse was entirely complete. They needed only to secure the final, massive ridge beam across the top before they could begin setting the heavy panes of glass. The air held a strange, tense stillness. The deadline was rapidly approaching. Elowen stood at the base of the southern stone wall, holding one end of the colossal pine timber. Gideon stood on the opposite side, balancing his heavy boots upon a jagged outcropping of wet, moss-covered rock. The earth near the southern slope was still dangerously soft from the massive storm that had ravaged the clearing earlier in the week. "Lift on the count," Gideon called out. his voice steady and powerful. Elowen planted her heavy boots, squaring her broad shoulders. The heavy leather gloves protected her palms as she gripped the rough bark. They hoisted the immense timber upward in perfect harmony. The massive weight suspended between them, slowly rising toward the heavy wooden brackets. They were inches away from securing the magnificent roof. Suddenly, a sickening, wet tearing sound echoed from the rocks. The soft, muddy earth beneath the heavy boots belonging to Gideon completely gave way. The jagged stone outcropping crumbled under the tremendous, combined weight of the giant man and the heavy timber. Gideon lost his footing instantly, sliding downward toward the rocky trench. "Release the wood," Gideon roared, trying to throw the massive beam away from his falling body. Elowen dropped her end, lunging forward with desperate, terrifying speed to grab him. She was entirely too late. The colossal pine timber plummeted downward with devastating force. Gideon crashed onto the unyielding rocks of the lower trench. Before he could roll his massive frame to safety, the tremendously heavy beam slammed violently against the jagged stone, trapping his lower body beneath the crushing weight of the wood. A sharp, sickening crack echoed through the silent mountain air. Gideon let out a harsh, agonizing groan, his massive hands instantly gripping the rough bark of the timber. The leg belonging to Gideon was pinned completely between the massive wooden beam and the unforgiving granite of the earth. Elowen scrambled down the slippery, muddy slope, her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm of absolute panic against her ribs. She threw her heavy hands under the massive timber, her thick muscles straining with unimaginable force, trying desperately to lift the crushing weight off the stoic mountain man. The beam did not move. It was wedged deeply into the narrow rock crevice, locked perfectly into place by the sheer weight of the fall. Gideon squeezed his dark eyes shut, his jaw clamped tightly in silent, blinding agony. The great protector of the high peaks was completely immobilized. Elowen looked down the steep mountain trail leading toward the valley below. A thick, dark column of gray smoke rose slowly above the distant timberline. The cruel men from the eastern banks had officially entered the mountain pass, and the giant man standing between Elowen and absolute ruin was trapped against the stone. The colossal pine timber refused to move, wedged tightly against the unforgiving granite beneath the immense weight of the massive beam. The sheer physical power belonging to Elowen was astonishing, yet human muscle alone could not defeat the crushing lock of the mountain stone. She realized the terrible danger immediately. Elowen scrambled backward up the slippery mud, her green eyes wildly scanning the ruined earth near the foundation trench. She spotted the thick iron digging bar resting near a pile of heavy rocks. She seized the cold metal, sprinting back down the treacherous slope. She jammed the heavy iron wedge deep beneath the massive wooden log, bracing the opposite end perfectly against a solid, unyielding slab of granite. "Pull the leg on my command," Elowen roared, the sound echoing fiercely across the high peaks. She threw the entire, monumental weight belonging to her towering frame against the iron lever. The thick muscles in her broad shoulders and back strained until they absolutely burned. She growled through her clenched teeth, pushing downward with terrifying, desperate force. The heavy iron bent slightly under the tremendous pressure. The massive timber groaned in protest. Slowly, agonizingly, the thick wood lifted exactly 3 inches from the crushing trap. Gideon dragged his injured limb free, rolling his heavy torso backward onto the freezing mud. He collapsed, his massive chest heaving as the blinding agony washed over him. Elowen immediately released the iron bar. The heavy wood crashed back against the stone with a deafening thud, but the mountain man was clear. She dropped to her knees beside him in the freezing mire. The heavy canvas dress belonging to her soaked up the muddy water. But she did not care. She slid her thick, wildly muscular arm beneath the broad back belonging to Gideon, hoisting his massive frame upward. A fragile woman could never have moved the giant timber cutter. But Elowen was a towering force of absolute survival. She locked her heavy arm around his waist, pulling his heavy arm securely over her broad shoulders. Together, the two giants staggered out of the rocky trench. The journey back to the cabin was slow and agonizing, heavily reliant upon the incredible, unyielding physical foundation belonging to Elowen. She bore the tremendous weight without a single complaint, matching his stumbling steps, guiding him up the heavy wooden stairs and pushing the thick door open. She guided him carefully toward the large wooden bed resting in the main room. Gideon collapsed onto the thick woven blankets, his dark eyes tightly shut against the overwhelming pain. Elowen did not panic. She had spent a lifetime tending to heavy farm injuries and surviving absolute cruelty. She moved with quiet, undeniable purpose. She stripped the heavy leather work gloves from her hands. She walked to the iron basin, pouring fresh water from the steaming kettle, adding a handful of dried willow bark and healing herbs from the heavy wooden shelf. She returned to the bed carrying the warm basin and a pair of sharp iron shears. With absolute precision, she cut away the thick denim fabric covering the heavy muscle belonging to Gideon. The injury was a terrifying landscape of dark, bruised flesh and torn skin, but the bone had miraculously held against the crushing impact. The heavy timber had caused severe damage, ensuring the great protector of the high peaks absolutely could not walk, let alone fight the approaching darkness. Elowen dipped a soft cotton cloth into the fragrant, warm water. She began to clean the terrible wound. The massive, deeply calloused hands belonging to the giant woman, the very same hands capable of splitting thick pine logs and lifting colossal foundation stones, moved over his broken flesh with astonishing, breathtaking grace. She applied the healing ointment with the absolute softness of a delicate whisper. She touched his agonizing injury with such profound care that Gideon opened his dark eyes, utterly mesmerized by the beautiful paradox of her existence. Her immense physical power was terrifying to the outside world, yet her spirit was entirely composed of gentle, magnificent warmth. The absolute tenderness vibrating within her massive hands brought a sudden, sharp sting of moisture to the eyes belonging to Gideon. He watched her carefully wrap clean, white cotton bandages around his damaged leg. He lay broken on the bed, staring at the towering woman who had just saved his life. A sudden, terrifying realization crashed over his soul, completely eclipsing the physical pain burning in his limb. For the very first time in his isolated existence, the giant mountain man experienced a profound, suffocating vulnerability. He was the protector. He was the guardian of the high wilderness. He had promised to stand between Elowen and the cruel men hunting her from the east. But now, he was completely immobilized. He could not lift the heavy iron rifle. He could not stand in the doorway to block the approaching threat. The rhythmic rubbing of his thumb against the side of his index finger began against the woven blanket. A frantic, quiet measurement of his terrible helplessness. He did not fear the pain. He did not fear the severe damage to his own body. He was completely terrified of losing the magnificent woman standing beside him. The profound emotional dependence he felt toward Elowen was absolute. She had become the very center of his world in a matter of days, and the realization that he could not physically shield her from the wolves waiting in the valley was absolute agony. Elowen finished tying the heavy bandage. She reached for the tin cup resting on the wooden table, filling it with the warm willow bark tea she had steeped over the fire. She brought the cup to his lips, gently sliding her large hand behind his neck to support his heavy head. "Drink," Elowen murmured softly. Her green eyes filled with quiet reassurance. "The bark will dull the fire in the blood." Gideon drank the bitter liquid. As she lowered the tin cup, he reached up. His massive, rough hand gently caught the thick wrist belonging to Elowen. He pressed his warm palm against the pulse, beating steadily beneath her skin. He did not speak a single word, but the desperate, aching plea in his dark eyes conveyed the entire depth of his terrifying love and overwhelming fear. Elowen placed her free hand over his massive fingers, offering a slow, profound nod. The deep, safe harbor they had built within the cabin wrapped around them, providing a fragile peace against the encroaching night. The heavy medicine finally pulled Gideon into a deep, feverish slumber. Elowen stood perfectly still beside the bed, ensuring his breathing was steady and calm. Once the giant man was fully asleep, she walked slowly across the heavy wooden planks toward the front window. The sun had completely vanished behind the jagged peaks, plunging the high wilderness into absolute darkness. The freezing mountain wind began to howl softly against the thick wooden shingles. Elowen stared through the frost-covered glass, looking down the steep, treacherous trail leading toward the valley below. The thin column of gray smoke she had spotted earlier had multiplied. Burning brightly against the absolute blackness of the freezing night were three distinct, massive campfires. The glowing orange flames were not located in the distant valley. They were burning at the very base of their specific trail. The cruel men from the eastern banks were no longer a distant threat. They were resting directly at the bottom of the mountain, waiting only for the pale light of dawn to climb the path and completely destroy the sanctuary she so deeply loved. The orange light radiating from the three massive campfires at the base of the mountain flickered like cruel eyes through the frost-covered glass of the window. Elowen stood absolutely still, her broad shoulders tense, her breath rising in shallow, terrified gasps. The men from the eastern banks were waiting for the dawn. The heavy dread pooling in her stomach felt colder than the freezing wind howling outside the thick wooden walls. A harsh, agonizing groan echoed from the shadows of the cabin. Elowen turned sharply. The heavy willow bark tea had dulled the immediate pain, but the powerful spirit belonging to Gideon absolutely refused to surrender to the heavy slumber. He threw the thick woven blanket aside, his dark eyes burning with a wild, feverish intensity. He planted his massive, calloused hands against the wooden frame of the bed, pushing his heavy torso upward. The thick muscles in his arms trembled violently under the intense physical strain. "Bring the heavy iron from the mantel," Gideon rasped, his voice a low, gravelly command vibrating with sheer defiance. "I need the rifle." Elowen sprinted across the heavy wooden planks, dropping to her knees beside the bed. She placed her large, deeply calloused hands against his broad chest, applying a gentle, unyielding pressure to force him backward. "You cannot stand," Elowen breathed, her voice filled with absolute terror. "The stone destroyed the muscle. The bone will shatter completely if you place your weight upon the floorboards." "I will not let them take you," Gideon growled, the raw desperation in his tone completely shattering the stoic mask he always wore. He fought against her hands, desperate to rise. "They will not cross the threshold. I will break the men before they touch a single hair upon your head." The magnificent, terrifying courage belonging to the giant mountain man brought a sudden, blinding rush of tears to the green eyes belonging to Elowen. He was broken, burning with fever, and completely immobilized, yet he was entirely willing to sacrifice his own life to protect her. The profound, Denton, overwhelming love vibrating within his fierce declaration was the most beautiful treasure she had ever known. She slid her massive hands upward, gently framing the rugged, unshaven face belonging to Gideon. She brushed her rough thumbs across his fevered cheekbones, offering a magnificent, quiet warmth. "Rest now," Elowen murmured, her voice trembling with the heavy weight of her unspoken decision. "The night is still dark. We will face the dawn together." The gentle, rhythmic stroke of her thumbs, combined with the heavy medicine, finally overwhelmed the fierce determination belonging to Gideon. He fought the darkness, the rhythmic rubbing of his thumb against the side of his index finger, slowing to a complete halt against the heavy blanket. He closed his dark eyes, his heavy breathing settling into the deep, slow rhythm of absolute exhaustion. Elowen remained on her knees for a long time, watching the massive chest rise and fall. The silence of the cabin pressed heavily against her ears, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire and the bitter wind outside. She slowly stood from the floorboards, walking toward the wooden table. The profound reflection washing over her soul was absolute and devastating. If she remained in the cabin, the heavily armed men from the east would climb the trail. They would kick down the heavy wooden door. Gideon would absolutely try to fight them. And because he was crippled, the cruel men would kill the honorable mountain giant without a single hesitation. They would burn the beautiful sanctuary to the freezing earth. They would destroy the life belonging to the man she loved. She was merely a giant beast of burden, born to endure pain. She was built for harsh labor and cruelty. Gideon was a noble guardian who deserved peace and a long, quiet life. The choice was horrifyingly simple. The sacred sacrifice was the only possible path forward. She must become the prey once more to ensure the absolute safety of the sanctuary. She moved through the shadows with total silence. She did not pack the iron trunk. She only gathered the heavy canvas cloaks she wore upon her arrival. She walked toward the heavy wooden table, gently placing the customized leather-work gloves upon the center of the scrubbed planks. She smoothed the thick leather, leaving the protective gift behind as a silent testament of her deep gratitude. She walked toward the dark corner of the room, stopping before the beautifully carved wooden cradle. She reached it out, gently touching the polished wood, honoring the quiet, unknown sorrow hidden within the soul belonging to the man she loved. Finally, Elowen returned to the side of the large wooden bed. The pale light of the dying embers cast a golden glow across the rugged features belonging to Gideon. She leaned forward, pressing her lips gently against his warm, fevered forehead. The magnificent warmth of his skin sent a final, agonizing wave of pure longing straight through her chest. "I love you," Elowen whispered into the absolute darkness, confessing the terrifying truth for the very first and absolute last time. "Forgive me." She turned away, pulling the heavy canvas cloak tightly around her broad shoulders. She walked to the front entrance, lifting the heavy iron bolt with agonizing slowness to prevent any metallic clatter. She pulled the thick wooden door open, stepping out into the brutal, freezing wind of the high wilderness. She did not close the heavy timber entirely, leaving the latch unfastened to ensure the loud noise would not wake the sleeping giant. She began the long, treacherous descent toward the burning campfires below, marching directly into the jaws of absolute cruelty. Hours passed. The bitter mountain wind abruptly blew the heavy wooden door wide open, sending a freezing blast of mountain air directly into the cabin. The sudden cold shattered the feverish slumber belonging to Gideon. He gasped heavily, his dark eyes flying open. The fire in the hearth was nothing but dead gray ash. He reached out his massive hand, expecting to find the comforting warmth belonging to Elowen sitting nearby. His rough fingers found only empty air. He forced himself onto his elbows, ignoring the blinding agony shooting up his ruined leg. He scanned the dark, freezing room. The heavy canvas cloak was gone. The large iron cup was empty. The customized leather gloves rested abandoned upon the wooden table. The heavy wooden door stood wide open, swinging violently in the harsh wind. Gideon realized the absolute horror of the empty cabin. A terrifying scream of pure panic tearing through his broad chest. Could the broken mountain giant drag himself down the steep, treacherous trail in time to stop the absolute destruction of the woman he loved? The freezing mud of the steep mountain trail sucked heavily against the thick boots belonging to Elowen. The descent was incredibly treacherous in the absolute darkness. Yet she did not stumble. She moved with the quiet, devastating purpose of a magnificent guardian marching toward the final sacrifice. She carried the beautiful memory of the warm, fevered forehead belonging to the mountain giant, allowing the profound love within her soul to fuel her terrifying courage. The pale, moss, bruised light of dawn slowly breached the eastern timberline, just as she reached the flat clearing at the base of the mountain pass. The three massive campfires burned fiercely, casting long, twisting shadows across the rocky earth. 4 men stood around the leaping flames. They wore heavy woolen coats and carried thick iron revolvers strapped tightly to their hips. They were rough and cruel men hardened by a lifetime of inflicting misery upon the weak. Elowen stepped out of the dark timberline and walked directly into the center of the firelight. The men turned. The cruel laughter died instantly in their throats. They expected a fragile, weeping girl to descend the mountain, terrified and begging for mercy. Instead, they faced a towering, wildly muscular giant who dwarfed the largest man in their company. Elowen threw the heavy canvas cloak back over her broad shoulders, exposing the sheer, overwhelming physical power hidden beneath the fabric. She stood with her long legs planted wide, her massive hands curled into tight, heavy fists at her sides. "I am the blood belonging to the family," Elowen rumbled, her deep voice vibrating with absolute, unyielding defiance over the crackling fires. "You seek the bride. I am the woman you will take." The leader of the group stepped forward, a vicious scar twisting his upper lip. He looked up at the towering woman, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of dark suspicion and undeniable fear. He reached into the deep pocket of his coat, pulling forth a pair of heavy iron shackles. "You are a massive beast," the leader sneered, taking a cautious step closer. "The employer demands the delicate sister, but heavy muscle will fetch a high price in the labor camps. The debt remains the same." Elowen did not flinch. She stared down at the cruel men, her green eyes burning with absolute authority. She was offering her freedom, but she absolutely refused to surrender her dignity. She extended her massive, calloused hands forward, fully prepared to accept the cold iron to ensure the safety of the sanctuary waiting far above. Before the leader could clamp the heavy metal around her thick wrists, a terrifying, metallic sound echoed from the dark shadows of the trail. The sharp, unmistakable click of a heavy iron rifle hammer being pulled back stopped the men completely cold. Elowen spun around. The breath caught painfully in her throat, a profound mixture of absolute horror and breathtaking love flooding her chest. Emerging from the heavy morning mist was the colossal frame belonging to Gideon. He leaned heavily upon a thick, twisted pine branch he had dragged from the forest floor, using the rough wood as a makeshift crutch. The thick white cotton bandages wrapped around his leg were heavily stained with fresh, dark blood. The agonizing journey down the steep mountain must have cost him unimaginable pain. Yet he stood entirely upright. The heavy iron rifle rested firmly against his massive shoulder. The long, deadly barrel aimed directly at the chest belonging to the cruel leader. The rhythmic rubbing of his thumb against the smooth wooden stock of the rifle began. A quiet, terrifying measurement of the exact force required to end the threat. "The woman belongs to the mountain," Gideon growled. His voice a low, demonic rumble of pure vengeance. "If you take one more step toward her, you will never leave this valley alive." The sheer, overwhelming presence belonging to the mountain man was absolutely terrifying. He looked like an ancient god of the wild, driven by an unstoppable, protective fury. Elowen immediately stepped backward, moving her massive frame directly in front of Gideon, to shield his broken body from the drawn weapons of the men. It was a flawless, instinctual movement of profound devotion. Gideon did not push her away. Instead, he gently pressed his large, free hand against the center of her broad back, anchoring her to his side. The magnificent warmth of his touch spread instantly through the freezing canvas of her dress. They stood entirely united, an unbreakable wall of heavy muscle, iron, and absolute solidarity. The cruel men hesitated. They looked at the giant woman, shielding the massive, heavily armed timber cutter. The sheer physical size of the two guardians standing together was a terrifying spectacle. The men were brutal, but they were not foolish enough to engage in a battle they absolutely could not win without suffering devastating casualties. "The debt is heavy," the leader muttered, taking a slow step backward away from the terrifying rifle. "But the blood is not worth the iron. We will return to the east." "Run," Gideon commanded softly, the absolute menace in his tone completely shattering the morning stillness. The men did not wait for a second warning. They turned quickly, rushing toward the heavy draft horses tied near the edge of the clearing. They scrambled into the leather saddles, kicking the exhausted beasts into a frantic gallop back toward the civilized world. The deep silence of the wilderness returned, leaving only the crackle of the dying campfires. Gideon lowered the heavy iron barrel toward the muddy earth. The incredible adrenaline keeping him upright suddenly vanished. His massive shoulders slumped, and he nearly collapsed. Elowen caught him immediately. She wrapped her thick, wildly muscular arms around his broad chest, holding his tremendous weight with effortless, breathtaking strength. She buried her face into the crook of his warm neck, inhaling the deep, familiar scent of pine and wood smoke. They survived. The unbreakable bond between them had defeated the darkness. Elowen slowly turned her head to look at the muddy ground where the men had stood. Resting in the freezing dirt was a folded piece of heavy white paper. The leader had dropped the document in his frantic haste to escape the mountain. She gently lowered Gideon onto a nearby boulder, ensuring his ruined leg was elevated. She walked toward the center of the camp, picking up the soiled document. She unfolded the heavy paper, her green eyes scanning the dark. Typewritten ink. The breath vanished completely from her lungs. The paper was an official bank ledger. It detailed the exact financial debt belonging to her family. But stamped boldly across the bottom of the page, in bright red ink, was a terrifying revelation. The massive debt had been paid entirely in full, settled with Eastern gold more than 6 months ago. If the family owed absolutely nothing to the cruel man from the silver locket, who had hired the brutal men to hunt Elowen across the continent, the freezing wind sweeping through the base of the mountain trail felt completely insignificant compared to the absolute ice filling the veins belonging to Elowen. She stared at the heavy white paper, her striking green eyes scanning the dark. typewritten ink of the official ledger over and over again. The massive debt had been completely paid. The bold red stamp across the bottom of the page confirmed the transaction had occurred exactly 6 months ago, weeks before she had ever boarded the train heading west. She lowered her gaze to the signature, resting upon the deposit line. The delicate, sweeping cursive was unmistakably familiar. The payment had been fully authorized by Clara. The fragile, weeping sister had not been hiding in absolute terror from the debt collectors. Clara had secretly married the cruel man from the silver locket. Together, they had seized absolute control over the farm belonging to the family. They had kept the heavy Eastern gold for themselves. The realization struck Elowen with the devastating force of a falling timber. The brutal men from the East had not been sent to collect a debt. They had been hired by her own sister to capture the giant beast of burden and sell her into the distant labor camps. Clara wanted to ensure the towering, ugly sister would completely vanish, forever eliminating any chance Elowen might return to claim her rightful share of the land. The absolute magnitude of the deceit shattered the heart belonging to Elowen. The profound betrayal by blood was an agony far worse than any physical strike she had ever endured. She had spent her entire existence shielding the delicate girl. She had stepped in front of the heavy iron rod to save the fragile bones belonging to Clara, earning the massive, terrifying scar upon her own shoulder. She had sacrificed her dignity, stolen a ticket, and thrown herself into the terrifying unknown wilderness, fully believing she was performing a sacred sacrifice to save the life of her sister. It was all a magnificent, cruel lie. She had bled for a ghost who actively despised her. Elowen fell heavily to her knees in the freezing mud, the official ledger slipping from her large, trembling hands. The sheer physical power she possessed meant absolutely nothing against the crushing weight of the deception. She was completely hollowed out, left with nothing but the devastating echo of her own misplaced loyalty. Gideon watched her from the cold surface of the boulder. He saw the magnificent strength suddenly vanish from her broad shoulders. He recognized the profound, terrifying collapse of her spirit. He did not ask what was written upon the paper. He understood the cruel world had finally inflicted the ultimate wound upon the giant woman. "We must return to the sky," Gideon murmured softly, his low voice carrying a profound, anchoring warmth through the bitter morning air. Elowen offered no reply. She simply nodded, her green eyes completely devoid of light. She stood from the mud, moving like a giant, wandering spirit. She walked toward the boulder, sliding her thick, wildly muscular arm beneath the broad back belonging to Gideon. She hoisted his tremendous weight upward, securing his heavy arm around her broad shoulders. The long journey back up the steep mountain trail was fraught with complete physical and emotional exhaustion. The sun rose higher above the jagged peaks, yet the pale light offered absolutely no warmth. They climbed the treacherous path in heavy, agonizing silence. Elowen acted as the unbreakable physical pillar, bearing the immense burden belonging to the mountain man. Her heavy boots slipped in the freezing mud, her thick muscles burning with intense, brutal fatigue, yet she completely refused to stop. The agonizing physical labor mirrored the devastating emotional journey she was enduring. She was carrying the heavy weight of a shattered reality, completely unsure of how to rebuild the foundation of her soul. Hours later, they finally breached the high timberline and entered the flat clearing. The magnificent sanctuary of the cabin waited for them. Standing proudly against the howling wind, Elowen pushed the heavy wooden door open. They stumbled across the thick wooden planks of the floorboards. She guided Gideon carefully toward the large wooden bed. Lowering his massive, exhausted frame onto the thick woven blankets. She checked the heavy white cotton bandages wrapped around his leg, ensuring the bleeding had stopped. She moved with quiet, undeniable purpose, functioning entirely on the deeply ingrained instinct of survival. She walked toward the stone hearth, picking up the heavy iron poker. She stirred the dead gray ashes, placing fresh birch bark and thick pine logs onto the grate. She struck the heavy flint, nursing the small spark until a brilliant, roaring fire blazed to life. The golden light filled the room, casting a deep, beautiful warmth across the heavy wooden planks. The absolute safety of the cabin completely surrounded them. The wolves from the east were gone forever. The sudden, profound realization of absolute safety was the final blow. With the terrifying adrenaline finally gone, the overwhelming dam, holding back the grief belonging to Elowen, completely shattered. She sank to the floorboards, directly in front of the blazing hearth. She pulled her long, if powerful legs against her broad chest, wrapping her thick, muscular arms around her knees in a desperate attempt to make her massive frame as small as possible. She began to weep. The giant woman, who had faced a howling tempest and a band of armed men without a single flinch, cried with profound, unrestrained vulnerability. The heavy, gasping sobs echoed through the quiet cabin, releasing a lifetime of brutal rejection, cruel mockery, and the absolute devastation of being entirely discarded by the only family she had ever known. Gideon lay upon the bed, his dark eyes watching the magnificent giant shatter completely upon his floorboards. The pain burning within his ruined leg felt entirely insignificant compared to the agonizing sorrow tearing through the woman he loved. He absolutely refused to let her endure the darkness alone. He pushed his massive torso upward, ignoring the blinding flash of agony shooting through his limb. He grasped the heavy, twisted pine branch resting near the bed. With tremendous, but terrifying effort, the broken mountain man forced himself to stand. He did not walk toward the weeping woman immediately. Instead, he dragged his heavy boot across the room, moving slowly toward the dark corner of the cabin. He reached the heavy shadows. He extended his large, calloused hands, gently grasping the beautifully polished wood of the small infant cradle. He lifted the delicate object, carrying the empty basin across the room with profound, sacred reverence. He reached the golden light of the fire. He lowered his massive frame onto the floorboards with a heavy grunt of pain, sitting directly beside the weeping giant. He rested the wooden cradle upon the planks between them. The warm light of the blazing fire danced across the smooth, beautifully carved rockers. Elowen slowly raised her head, her striking green eyes completely red and filled with heavy tears. She looked at the mysterious, empty basin, then raised her gaze to meet the deeply soulful eyes belonging to the stoic timber cutter. What devastating secret did the silent cradle hold? And how would the hidden truth finally heal the deepest, most agonizing wounds buried within their shattered souls? The blazing fire in the stone hearth snapped and hissed, casting a rich, golden light across the beautifully carved wooden cradle resting upon the heavy floorboards. Elowen stared at the smooth, polished rockers. Her massive chest heaved with the fading rhythm of her heavy sobs. The agonizing betrayal from the eastern banks still burned within her soul. Yet the profound, quiet reverence radiating from the giant man sitting beside her commanded her absolute attention. Gideon did not look at the roaring fire. He looked entirely at the small, empty wooden basin. The rhythmic rubbing of his thumb against the side of his index finger began, moving with a slow, devastating sorrow. He reached out his massive, heavily calloused hand, He gently traced the edge of the smooth timber, touching the wood with the absolute delicacy of a man holding a sacred relic. "The travel papers registered me as a lonely widower," Gideon murmured, his deep voice trembling slightly in the warm air of the cabin. "The letters I sent to the east spoke of a quiet life lacking the gentle touch of a woman. But the documents were a lie. The story I told was a cowardly deception." Elowen held her breath. The striking green eyes belonging to her watched the heavy sorrow pooling in the dark gaze of the mountain giant. She did not interrupt. She offered him the absolute sanctuary of her silence. "I never had a wife," Gideon breathed, the heavy confession falling into the quiet room like a falling stone. "I have lived upon this mountain in absolute isolation for 10 long years. The solitary life suited the heavy muscle and the quiet nature belonging to me. I built the walls. I felled the timber. I believed the rugged rocks and the freezing wind were the only companions I would ever need." He slowly moved his rough fingers from the edge of the cradle, resting his large hand upon his heavy knee. 2 winters ago, a brutal blizzard swept through the high pass," Gideon continued, his voice dropping into a raw, painful whisper. "A wagon belonging to travelers moving west broke an axle near the timberline. The storm buried them completely. I found the wreckage 3 days later. The parents had perished in the freezing snow. But wrapped inside a heavy woolen blanket, tucked safely against the chest of the mother, was a tiny infant boy. He was barely breathing, but the spirit belonging to him was absolutely fierce. The heart belonging to Elowen ached with a profound, sudden understanding. She looked at the massive, deeply scarred hands belonging to Gideon. She pictured those tremendous hands holding a fragile, freezing infant, carrying the tiny life through the howling mountain winds. "I brought the boy into the cabin," Gideon stated, a fragile, magnificent smile touching the corners of his mouth for a brief second. "I warmed the milk. I sat beside the hearth for 5 days without sleeping, breathing the warm air from my lungs over his tiny face, until the color returned to his cheeks. I carved this wooden cradle from the heart of a fallen oak tree. I named the boy Silas. For 3 beautiful, magnificent months, the heavy silence of the mountain was entirely broken by the absolute joy of a child. The smile vanished from the rugged face belonging to the timber cutter. The dark eyes belonging to him filled with a devastating, overwhelming agony. Then the deep winter fever arrived," Gideon whispered, a single, heavy tear escaping his dark eyes and tracking through the wild dust upon his cheek. The sickness moved through his tiny lungs with absolute cruelty. "I am a giant man. I can lift colossal pine logs. I can stand against heavily armed men. I can survive the most brutal mountain storms. But all the heavy muscle and sheer physical power belonging to me meant absolutely nothing against the invisible fever." He bowed his head, the overwhelming grief completely crushing his broad shoulders. "I sat in this exact spot on the floorboards, holding the tiny body belonging to Silas, completely helpless as the fever took the life from him. I buried the boy beneath the ancient pine tree at the edge of the clearing. The absolute devastation shattered the soul belonging to me. I felt entirely broken. I felt like a massive, useless beast who had failed the only fragile thing he ever tried to protect." The blazing fire popped loudly, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up the dark chimney. "I wrote to the agency seeking a delicate bride," Gideon confessed, finally turning his dark eyes to meet the tear-filled gaze of Elowen. "I did not want a wife. I wanted an illusion. I foolishly believed a fragile, soft-spoken woman could bring the gentle innocence back to the mountain. I thought a delicate soul could somehow replace the beautiful fragility I had lost. I believed I was entirely too ruined. too heavily scarred, to ever earn the love of a real, powerful partner. The complete, devastating truth rested between them. Stripped of all defenses and heavy armor, Elowen looked at the giant, broken man sitting beside her. The profound realization washed over her with breathtaking clarity. They were exactly the same. They were two massive, towering giants possessing terrifying physical strength. Yet both of their souls had been entirely shattered by the cruel world. She had sacrificed her life to protect a fragile sister who actively despised her. He had sacrificed his heart to protect a fragile child the winter had stolen. They were both outcasts, desperately yearning for a place to belong, completely terrified of their own heavy scars. Elowen did not speak. Words were entirely useless against the magnitude of the shared sorrow. She unclasped her arms from her knees. She leaned her massive frame forward. She reached out with her large, deeply calloused hands, gently framing the rugged, tear-stained face belonging to Gideon. She did not use her immense size for brutal labor. She used the tremendous warmth of her giant hands to offer the ultimate, profound healing. She pressed her forehead gently against the warm brow belonging to the mountain man. The physical contact completely shattered the final, agonizing walls built around the heart of Gideon. He closed his dark eyes, leaning his heavy weight into her massive palms. He brought his own large hands upward, wrapping his rough fingers gently around the thick wrists belonging to Elowen. The profound emotional surrender was absolute. They did not need to hide the heavy muscle, the terrifying scars, or the agonizing grief. They had found the exact piece of the universe perfectly forged to match their own broken edges. The overwhelming, deep love vibrating between the two giant survivors reached an absolute, breathtaking crescendo. They slowly leaned closer, the quiet space between their lips vanishing, as they prepared to seal the magnificent bond with a long, deeply earned embrace. Suddenly, a deafening, explosive roar completely shattered the beautiful sanctuary. The howling wind outside escalated into a sudden, demonic shriek. A brutal, terrifying blast of mountain air slammed against the front of the cabin, with the overwhelming force of a falling avalanche. The heavy iron hinges holding the front door groaned violently, then completely snapped. The massive wooden door blew completely off the frame, crashing wildly onto the heavy floorboards of the cabin, bringing a swirling, terrifying vortex of freezing white snow and absolute darkness directly into the center of the room. The brutal, freezing tempest roared directly into the heart of the cabin, instantly extinguishing the bright golden flames within the stone hearth. Total darkness and absolute, biting cold consumed the room. The violent mountain wind howled like a wounded beast, whipping the heavy snow across the heavy wooden planks and tearing at the thick woven blankets resting upon the bed. The sanctuary was completely breached. Gideon immediately lunged forward, ignoring the blinding agony shooting up from the ruined leg belonging to him. He reached into the dark, desperate to shield Elowen from the freezing blast. But the giant woman did not cower. She did not freeze in terror. Elowen rose from the floorboards like an ancient, magnificent titan awakening from a deep slumber. The massive muscles belonging to her broad shoulders bunched under the thick thermal shirt. She marched directly into the center of the howling vortex. She reached down into the freezing snow piling upon the floorboards, curling her heavily calloused hands around the thick edges of the fallen oak door. With a terrifying, deafening roar of pure defiance, she hoisted the massive wooden slab upward. The demonic wind fought her relentlessly, pushing against the heavy timber with the absolute force of a falling avalanche. Elowen planted her heavy boots into the wooden planks, her long legs straining with unimaginable, overwhelming power. She absolutely refused to let the cruel world destroy the beautiful home she had finally found. Suddenly, a heavy, massive weight joined her at the center of the storm. Gideon dragged his broken body across the room, throwing his broad shoulder against the thick wood beside her. He could not stand upon the leg belonging to him, but the massive chest and heavy arms he possessed retained the sheer, monumental power of a true mountain guardian. "Push," Gideon commanded over the deafening roar, his voice vibrating with absolute, unyielding resolve. They moved in perfect, breathless harmony. The two giants threw their combined, colossal strength against the howling darkness. The heavy oak door moved forward, slicing through the violent wind. They slammed the thick wood directly back into the ruined iron frame. "The table," Elowen gasped, holding the tremendous weight of the door in place with her massive back. Gideon immediately dropped to the floorboards. He dragged his heavy frame toward the center of the room, curling his large hands around the thick legs belonging to the massive dining table. He pulled the heavy furniture across the room, wedging the thick edge tightly against the center of the oak door. Elowen quickly grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, jamming the thick metal beneath the table legs to lock the absolute barricade into place. The violent howling of the wind immediately faded into a muffled, distant drone. The freezing snow settled onto the floorboards. They survived the breach. Elowen collapsed against the heavy wooden table, her massive chest heaving with deep, ragged breaths. She looked down at the giant man resting upon the floorboards. Gideon looked up at her through the deep darkness. The silence between them was completely breathless. Slowly, a profound, magnificent warmth began to radiate through the freezing air. Elowen moved away from the door. She walked to the hearth, striking the heavy flint with absolute determination. She nursed the tiny spark, blowing her warm breath over the dry birch until the golden fire leaped back to life. She gathered the heavy woven blankets, wrapping them tightly around the shivering shoulders belonging to Gideon. They sat entirely together upon the floorboards, holding one another as the final hours of the dark night slowly surrendered to the dawn. The violent storm finally broke just as the sun crowned the jagged peaks. The absolute silence of the pure mountain morning wrapped around the cabin. Elowen stood, pulling the heavy table away from the door. She opened the thick timber, stepping out onto the frost-covered porch. The world outside was entirely transformed. A thick, pristine blanket of white snow covered the heavy mud, the ruined trees, and the dark memories of the cruel men from the east. The wilderness was completely cleansed, shining like a magnificent ocean of diamonds beneath the bright, piercing blue sky. Gideon stepped onto the porch beside her, leaning heavily upon the twisted pine branch. The white cotton bandages wrapping the leg belonging to him were clean. The terrible fever had completely broken. He looked at the towering, wildly muscular woman standing beside him. The golden light of the morning sun illuminated the striking green eyes belonging to Elowen. The wild dust was gone. The heavy terror was gone. She stood proud, powerful, and absolutely breathtaking. Gideon reached out, letting the pine branch fall to the snowy floorboards. He balanced his heavy weight, raising his large, deeply calloused hands to cradle the beautifully rugged face belonging to the giant woman. "The letters from the east were an illusion," Gideon murmured, his deep voice carrying the absolute, unwavering truth of a sacred vow. "But the magnificent strength, the profound courage, and the beautiful heart belonging to you are the only realities I will ever need. You are my true sanctuary, Elowen." You are my permanent home. The heart belonging to Elowen swelled with an overwhelming, absolute joy. The lifetime of cruel mockery, heavy burdens, and devastating betrayal vanished completely into the cold morning air. She was no longer a beast of burden. She was a cherished, powerful queen of the high peaks. And you are my home, Elowen breathed, her voice trembling with absolute adoration. She leaned down slightly, closing the final space between them. Their lips met in a profound, earth-shattering embrace. The kiss contained absolutely no hesitation. It was a magnificent, deeply earned merging of two heavily scarred survivors who had finally found absolute peace within the heavy arms belonging to one another. The old storytellers of the high territory often speak of the fierce mountain winds and the heavy stones that outlast the deepest winters. They say some fires are meant to burn down to the absolute ash, so a new, magnificent forest can grow from the ruined earth. The years that followed the great storm brought an era of profound, unwavering peace to the high cabin. The terrible injury belonging to Gideon eventually healed, leaving a heavy limp that only served as a quiet reminder of the price he paid for true love. The winter greenhouse they built together flourished against the southern stone wall, bringing bright, fragile life into the harsh wilderness. They cultivated the earth, not out of a desperate need to survive, but from a deep, overflowing desire to nurture the world around them. The heavy scars marking the massive shoulder belonging to Elowen faded into pale ribbons, losing their terrible power. She never returned to the cruel valleys of the east. She never looked back at the ghosts who had betrayed her. She ruled the high timberline, alongside the honorable giant who worshipped the ground she walked upon. They never hid their terrifying size from the world, because the world no longer mattered. They became a legend among the frontier towns below, two massive, unyielding guardians of the high peaks who lived in absolute, unbreakable harmony. And as the turning seasons slowly brought new joy to the isolated sanctuary, the beautifully carved wooden cradle resting by the warm hearth finally found a new, magnificent purpose, filled with the laughter of children who would never know the harsh cruelty of the world, protected forever by the sheer, magnificent strength belonging to the mountain giants. This story is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, locales, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This narrative is crafted strictly for entertainment and emotional reflection, adhering to all family safe and YPP guidelines.